Good morning, gentlemen. I'm out. I've just come out of a military canteen and I thought I had some time and I'll make a small video on a very interesting subject. And what I'm going to talk about now is the India China border dispute. Now, whether you can call it a border dispute or a disagreement or whatever it is, the fact is India and China have a border about 3,300 kilometers and it is undemarcated. It has never been demarcated. And we have to check which is the way forward, rather the best course of action for India. Now, before I say anything further, we'll have to discuss a bit of the historical concept behind this entire imbroglio. The border with China is actually the border with Tibet, and for many decades, Tibet was a buffer state between India and China. And this was thanks to the Raj, the British rule, who was omnipotent power in Asia. They were the biggest power, and the Chinese had to accept it. Actually, it started in 1842 when the first Opium War took place. China was defeated, and again in 56, I think there was a second Opium War, and China was again defeated. And China continued to be under the suzerainty of the Western powers, so much so that even Beijing there used to be a foreigners' quarter, international quarter, and Shanghai and Hong Kong were as good as out of the Chinese orbit. Now, what is the veracity of the Indian claim on the border? Actually, the Indians say that the eastern border is as per the McMahon line. Now, the McMahon line is an imaginary line which was drawn by Henry McMahon, who was the chief secretary of the government of India, and the line is named after him. It was not made in any relation to any physical boundary, but was drawn on the pen with the on the map with a pen. While in the eastern sector, that is the western sector, that is Ladakh and Aksai Chin, there is something called the Johnson Line. When one of the British explorers had gone to Mr. Johnson went there and demarcated an area in Aksai Chin and called it as part of the British Empire. Now, were these areas part of India in the centuries gone by? Now, as far as Aksai Chin is concerned, I don't think India had ever any claim over that territory for almost 2000 years. I am not aware of any Indian king, whether it was Ashok or Aurangzeb or Babur or anybody, who had control over that area or he sent his army there. Only Maharaj Ranjit Singh did go up to Ladakh, but that's about all. Aksai Chin, which is an area almost about 38,000 kilometers, left untouched till the British became the omnipotent power in India after the 1857 mutiny. As far as the eastern frontier is concerned, that is the Northeast Frontier Agency, which was earlier in Arunachal Pradesh, were also never part of the Indian Empire. Never. I'm not aware whether in history any Indian king, whether it was Aurangzeb or anybody, ever conquered that area. There were semi-independent states there who owed allegiance, some of them to Tibet, the Lama there, just as Aksai Chin also had close association with the Chinese, with the Tibetans. And the Tibet was, of course, an independent entity in the 20th century, and that was thanks to the British. A point to be noted is that China has always claimed suzerainty over Tibet, but it has not been entirely successful all the time. When in 1903 1904, Jiang husband launched his operation against the Tibetans, the Dalai Lama at that time ran away to Xinjiang, and the Chinese stripped him of his power. That means he was beholden to the Chinese emperor. So China had a stake in Tibet, but the British decided they wanted to have a bigger stake, and as they were the paramount military power, they decided to call the Chinese and Tibetan representatives for what is known as the Shimla meeting of 1913, where the representatives of the Dalai Lama and the Chinese emperor they gathered there for a meeting to sort out the border problem. And the British shoved the problem down the throats of the Chinese and the Tibetans and made them sign on the dotted line, wherein they enforced that the McMahon line would be the eastern border and the Johnson line would be the western border. The Tibetan representative signed, but the Chinese representative only initialed and did not sign, and later both the countries reneged on that. They didn't accept it, that particular agreement. But they had no military power, so they couldn't enforce anything, and so it became a fait accompli. That means it was accepted by the British and also tacitly by the Tibetans that these areas were part of the British Empire. That is, the Johnson Line and the McMahon Line. The British kept everything under their thumb, under their control, and they had built up a very formidable fighting machine in the Indian Army, which is known as the British Indian Army, which also took part in the Boxer Wars and also in the Tibet invasion of 1903 under Brigadier Young Husband. Now, these are the facts of history. I mean, we can't get away from it. That means the British enforced the border because they were the imperialistic power. And also, the second point is that India, when it was independent, whether it was under the Mughals or the Hindus earlier, never had control over Aksai and the areas which are contentious now. And that is the Chinese point. They say this is a historical legacy. We don't recognize it. They're justified. I would say they're not justified. And we're wrong to say they're not justified. These are imperialistic hangovers which India took over. Now, when you take over something from the imperialist power, you've got to work and do everything in the same way. That means you've got to build up your military power. You've got to be proactive, aggressive, which the Indians were not. Because we had a man, a pacifist like Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, and he's gone on record and said when the British chief of the Indian Army had gone to him with a proposal to reorganize the army, he said, I don't need the army. He said, what for? That was in 1948, 47, I think. I don't need the army. I've got the police and they'll do the job. So you can well imagine the horizon of this man. He was totally out of touch with reality. He had only been used to watching Gandhi spinning the charkha and doing some agitation and singing songs. He had no idea of what is strategic concept, what is strategic power, and with the result, he just took over as the Prime Minister of India, carried on with the same maps which had been made by the British without taking physical control of those areas. Aksai Chin, an area of almost about 37,000 square miles, was left unattended. Nobody knew about it, neither Nehru or the cabinet or anybody. And a great guilt is there on the Indian General Staff led by General Karyappa and Rajendra Singh and all these fellows. I'm sorry to say they failed the nation. They never alerted Nehru, which they should have done. They were always interested in playing ball with the three bags full. And the same thing happened in Nefa. Tawang was not part of India. And Tawang, at one stage, he was a tributary and used to pay tribute to the Dalai Lama till the British made the border line, by Henry McMahon drew the pen on the border. Now, these are very sad thoughts. In other words, historically, if you look at it, India has very little claim on these areas. There are two things. One is conquest, and if the British had conquered it and forced it, then India was to build up its military power and keep on to it. Set up the civil administration, do something. They did nothing. And all this came out only, I think, in 1959, when an Indian police patrol was ambushed at a place called Demchok in Ladakh, and about 8 to 10 Indian policemen were killed by the Chinese. That was the beginning, and that is how the problem came out. Though Nehru had come to know about it in 54 and 55, even when he visited Beijing, that Chinese have built a road from Tibet to Xinjiang, and the Indians didn't know about it. And Nehru then made some very silly statements. He said he would allow the Chinese to use the road for civilian traffic. I mean, how are you going to enforce anything? I mean, when you don't have an army, you got nothing. How are you going to enforce it? And then he went on making all sorts of absurd statements here and there, which had got no relevance. And once he made a statement about Ladakh, when he came to know that entire Aksai Chin has been taken away by China, he said, not a blade of grass goes there. Fine. The leader of the opposition that time, was one of the opposition MPs, was Mr. Mahavir Tyagi, and he told Nehru, my head also doesn't have any hair. Does it mean it should be cut? So anyway, Nehru had no answer. He never had any answer. He didn't know. And at that time, he was reaching a stage of absolute confusion. He didn't know what to do. He was scared of the army, that there'll be a military coup, because there had been a coup in Burma. General Nevin had taken over. And then in Pakistan, Field Marshal Ayub Khan, self-styled, had taken over Pakistan as dictators. So Nehru was worried that similar things should happen in India. So the idea to keep the army defanged, no, don't give it any importance. That's but then things turned, and there was pressure in Parliament to take action, and Nehru started what is called a proactive policy. Now, what is this proactive policy? This was to try and thwart the Chinese further encroachment in Aksai Chin and Ladakh by sending Indian forward posts there and setting up there. All this is expressly brought out in a wonderful book, India's China War by Maxwell. I mean, if you have time, you must read this book and give you a graphic account, blow by blow, page by page, as to what really happened at that time. The intelligence bureau, which was headed by Malik, was a total loss, failure. It was a pro-Chinese group. The Indian Defense Minister Krishna Menon was supposed to be a leftist, but he didn't know what leftists mean. He was a pro-China man. And all these people, conspired to convince Nehru there is no danger from China, nothing. The Chinese wanted a border settlement. Why? Because they wanted to get rid of the old imperialistic ideas and concepts which had been left behind by the British. And repeatedly they were emphasizing that the border is a creation of the British and not recognized by us. So please negotiate with us. But Nehru was firm. He said, no, we are going to negotiate anything because all this is ours. And that policy has continued throughout the years. And just, I think, about 2 years or 3 years back, the Home Minister, Mr. Amit Shah, made a very silly statement in Parliament. He said, we will take back Aksai Chin. हम ले लेंगे अगर हमारी जान भी जाएगी. That means even if our life goes, we'll take Aksai Chin. Now, these statements antagonize China because, and to make them was very foolish. When you don't have the military power to take back even one village in Aksai Chin, how are you talking that you take entire Aksai Chin back? So the reality must sink into everybody. And I will say, even into the Indian masses who are thinking that all these areas belong to India and India should go and take them. You can never take those areas. And China, I think, did make an attempt to solve the problem. In 61 or 60, I don't remember, can't not the exact year, Chow and Lai came to Delhi. He spent a week there and he brought a proposal. He had just come back from Burma after signing the famous border pact with Burma, in which the Chinese had recognized the McMahon line as the border. And he came with a similar proposal to India. His proposal was accept that the border is a creation of British imperialism, number one. Number two, we'll go by what you say. You give something, we'll give something. We recognize the McMahon line as the eastern border. You recognize Aksai Chin as part of India, part of China. Unfortunately, the Indian government couldn't agree. There was no unity, nothing, and Nehru was living in his own world, dream world that he's a great statesman and all that, which has got no relevance really because he's. And finally, one fine day, 80,000 Chinese troops struck across the mighty Himalayan border. The Indians were not ready. They had only been positioning small pickets to occupy some territory. And what happened was a rout, a defeat. The Indians troops were facing the Chinese with 15 rounds of ammunition, nothing. And the soldiers who were rushed to the front had no winter clothing, nothing. And the Chinese were equipped, and it was the most crushing defeat. Thankfully, the Air Force was not used, otherwise, there would have been total massacre of the Indians. Because if the Air Force had been used, the Chinese would not have hesitated to bomb the North Indian cities of Lucknow, Delhi, and all, which are just 100 miles from the border. And we didn't have any proper air defense also at that time. Now, all this I'm stating to give you a perspective, and to sum up again, I'll tell you, India had no control over these areas historically. Number two, these areas were made part of British India by the British, by the force of the gun. And if India was to continue, it should have continued in the same way, built up the military, built up these areas, taken physical possession of these areas. That was required, which they didn't do. They didn't want to take over anything, just sit and talk. And men who talk, they don't do anything. And that's what Nehru was doing. He's talking, philosophy. That's all right. You don't want. Stalin was not a philosopher. He's a man who did nuts and bolts. He did it. Even Churchill, he was talking around too much. He did it. He just held to the weak sign that we're going to beat Germany, and they did it. Nehru did nothing like this. And once the Chinese had punctured his ego, he couldn't show his face anywhere in the world. Now, this proposal, which was made by Chow Lai, was again revived, I think, in 81 when Deng was head of the head of affairs in China. But again, it lapsed. 40 years down the line, I think the Chinese are justified in convinced in being sure that Indians do not want a border settlement. They are just expansionists. They are trying to carry on with the British policy, imperialistic policy. And now the Chinese have been nibbling away at the Indian territory because the Indians never had the courage, the gumption to face them. Now, when you want to do something, you want to get something back, and if statements like Mr. Amit Shah made are to be put into practice, you've got to build up your army, build up your weapons, the air, and have your strategic thinking. I have done the Staff College, but there is no study which is done there as to how the Indian army is going to move and attack into Tibet. Do we have a strike corps to go inside Tibet and capture Lhasa? What is the concept? The concept is nothing. It's a defensive concept, the Durg mentality, which has been brought out by Field Marshal Montgomery's History of Warfare. Durg mentality means you want to keep sitting in your fort, waiting for the enemy to come. You want to go out. And that has been the Indian strategy throughout history, whether it was Tipu Sultan or Ibrahim Lodi, all these fellows did follow the same tactics. And they lost. And India also lost because they're following all the same tactics. Now the question is what next? Somebody has to bite the bullet, and I think the best man at the moment who is in a position to do it is Narendra Modi. He will be recognized as a great man if he can solve the border problem with China. Now, what can be the solution of the border problem? Let us be very sure when two adversaries are negotiating together, and if they are of equal military strength, there is a discussion. But if one of the adversaries is very strong, the other is weak, you don't have the say. Even in property law, possession is 9/10 truth. And Chinese have Aksai Chin for the last 50, 60 years. In that case, how can India ever take it back? So why not recognize it officially? At the same time, the Indians could make some adjustments and maybe hark back to what the Chinese were saying earlier and try and see that the McMahon line is accepted as the border. This has to be negotiated. And if you think that you are going to get out of it, this, you know, pincer movement and by just making bravado statements, you're not going to help anybody. Arunachal Pradesh is a disputed territory now, and India will have to make some accommodation there also. But if India is magnanimous and the leadership is practical, because we don't have the military power and we cannot match China militarily because our thinking is morbid. And how morbid it is, you can well imagine that the government has now started the Agnipath scheme where 75% of the army is going to be conscripted and they'll just 4 years and go away. You expect such an army to fight the Chinese? And let's say there's a two front war, Pakistan, China versus India, where are you going to stand? So one has to be realistic. Pakistan will not make peace with India. It's a case of religious a jihad which the Pakistanis feel. They feel India betrayed them by breaking away East Pakistan. Well, to an extent it is true. But China is a different kettle of fish. China is now resurgent. In 60, 61, when Chow came, China was not a big power. They were looking for accommodation. Now they are not looking for any accommodation. And now they want to do it only at their level. There's an SEO conference going to take place in another few days, and Modi is going to attend it. And the Chinese and Indians are locked in eyeball to eyeball confrontation in Ladakh. And the chances are that there is be a disengagement so that Mao, the Chinese President Xi and Modi can meet. There are many who are suggesting Modi should meet Xi and all that. I think they're talking out of their hats. Are they aware about the power of the Chinese, the military power, and by not meeting them, meeting you're going to antagonize China more. The problem is going to be aggravated. And if somebody thinking America is going to come on the Indian side, forget it. It's never going to happen. They give you some weapons here and there. That's about all. Their first priority is Pakistan. India's second priority, and they are also right because throughout history, India never joined America anytime. The Indian policy has to change. We have to get friends with Israel. Now, Israel is the only pro-Indian country in the world, I find. I don't think any other country is pro-India at all. Even Nepal and Bhutan also going out of the Indian orbit, Bangladesh, Lanka, Burma, nothing is, no, none of them in the Indian orbit. They're not bothered about India. So in that case, the only solution forward if you want peace in our time is to have a border settlement with China. In principle, if you agree that, and the principle is that whatever China has is going to be with China, let it go. But it requires a real statesman to decide that. The Chinese and the Russians had a border dispute and they accepted, they solved it. It's a fact. They had border clashes in 69 when a lot of Chinese and Russian soldiers died. And now they are both thick allies together against the United States. To think that Russia is going to temper China and India is friendly with Russia and play be goody goody, not going to happen. Russia is dependent on China and Russia is already suffering big defeats in Ukraine. So the Russians don't know what to do. I don't think Putin is going to antagonize China by supporting India too much. He's not going to do it. Not against China. He might do it against America. And America is not going to enter into a conflict with China. Now, India is on its own. And when you're on your own and you're militarily weak, you have to have an adjustment and give something to the Chinese. There are people who are talking that China, if you give something to China, they'll ask for more. Well, that is a possibility. Certainly, it is. But you have to build up your military as a deterrent that this doesn't happen. And that is doing away with schemes like Agnipath and all other crap which they have started. Increase the defense budget, increase your army, increase the GDP. Pakistan is one-fifth the size of India, but maintains an army almost 60% of the size of the Indian army. If the Pakistan can do it, why not India? What is the problem here? Problem is the mentality of the Hindu mind which has ruled India. I think more people are now talking about Hindutva and all the things which had been under the carpet for 1,000 years, because almost 700 to 800 years the Muslim ruled the Hindus, and then another 200 years they were ruled by the British. So, gentlemen, these are harsh truths, and many people will not like what I've said. And I will reiterate, firstly, India has a very weak claim on these areas, number one. Number two, this is the creation of the British imperialism, the entire border. Number three, China doesn't recognize it. Number four, China is militarily stronger than India and has already occupied most of the area which they claim. And the last point is, in case you want peace, you have to have a border settlement with China. I will close now, gentlemen. I hope you all like this video. Do think over it, because it's a very important statement that I'm making here. And I will close now with the words Jai Hind and God bless. If you like the video, please share it, like it, and subscribe. Goodbye.